so nice. Try to do that yourself and see how hard it is. It's deceptively easy, meaning it's very hard. Hammer Time is a story that Scott Peterson wrote, and it's if I started reading now and kept reading it all the way through, I would still be reading it, after 2 o'clock. So I'm going to read it until I get interrupted, and then I'm going to stop right then and read the rest of it next week. That's just what I'm going to do. Scott Peterson wrote, "My big sister's a rock star. 2 years my senior. Christy and I fought like cats and dogs as kids, but she was always smarter, tougher, and faster than me. By high school, we'd somehow worked things out and become best friends. In 1968, she ran for Mendocino High School student body vice president and chose me as her campaign manager, so naturally she won. But it wasn't her first office. The year before, she'd become worthy advisor at the local chapter of Rainbow Girls, which was a subchapter of the Eastern Star organization. Christy had worked her way up through the ranks at Ocean View chapter number 111, starting there as a recorder in 1965 at the age of 14. Childhood memories are funny. What you remember isn't necessarily the most important, but certainly the most unusual. Christie's installation was no exception. It was held upstairs in the local Masonic Lodge, now the Savings Bank of Mendocino County building. Historic building interiors were a dime a dozen in those days. This was different, way different, beginning with the smell. Musty doesn't describe the aroma of that place. The word odor doesn't cut it either, but that's the first thing I remember, the smell. It wasn't bad or good. It wasn't old either. It was fucking ancient. The decor there was interesting, that's for sure, but the smell was absolutely spellbinding because, truth be told, that's all I remember. Evidence of that memory appeared in a cardboard box destined for the dumpster a few years back. Christy and I had gone through my parents' household effects and threw lots of things out, but Judy, being the conservative soul she is, rescued something. It was an acrylic gavel from that installation, marked with Christy's name, title, and date, October 1, 1967, 50 years ago. Gavels, to put it bluntly, are hammers used by those in charge of assemblies to maintain order. The one in the United States Senate was first used in 1789, but had no handle. Hammers with handles have been with us since time immemorial, serving both builders and destroyers. The war hammer came about circa 1382, when rebellious Parisians seized 3,000 of them from the city armory to maintain their own kind of order. Judicial hammers gained popularity in the United States after the American Civil War ended. Henry M. Robert of Robert's Rules of Order suggested it in 1876 as a way to maintain order in any meeting, something that certainly wasn't lost on a lawyer named Dr. Rob Morris, who founded the Eastern Star organization, and in doing so brought about the death of at least one chapter of that esteemed charity at the hands of a murderous necrophiliac child. We'll get to that later. Edmund Emil Kemper III stands 6'9" tall. His IQ is 145. He had a close relationship with his father until his parents separated in 1957. Then his mother started in on him, berating him for everything under the sun. One roof raiser was whether or not he should have his teeth cleaned. So he reciprocated by cleaning his mother's teeth after killing her with a hammer and then decapitating her, polishing it off with a little involuntary fellatio from her cold, lifeless head, after which he used it as a dartboard, screamed at it, and then ultimately smashed her face in. Why do I bring these morbid details up? Because that's exactly what happened to the Rainbow Girls in Mendocino. Ocean View chapter number 111 of the Eastern Star started up in 1891. Oscar Ann Stedman, date of birth 1960-ish, is the worthy matron here, or was, until a horny old mason named Oscar Emil Fuentes, date of birth 11/10/42, showed up. Stedman had beaten Fuentes to Mendocino County by a full 2 years. But Fuentes, as a mason, had her by the short and curly, so he started chasing her. He definitely wanted to get into my pants, Stedman told me, but I didn't want him. Fuentes' second choice was a wannabe named Linda Hanstead, who happily wrapped her legs around Fuentes' wrinkled ass, but then put the stink eye on Stedman, stink eye, who'd already had a run-in with an Eastern Star official named Chris Diaz over Diaz's attempted micromanagement of the Mendocino chapter. So naturally, Hanstead got appointed as Stedman's new deputy. It was bizarre, Stedman told me. I had no interest in Hanstead's husband, but she definitely had it out for me. And by then, Hansted and Diaz had become fast friends. It wasn't just Stedman that Hansted and Diaz wanted gone. It was the entire Mendocino chapter. That was in 2006. So it took some time to pull it off. In October of 2016, Diaz sent the chapter a letter. You are ordered to appear, blah, 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 for which Stedman complied. The appearance was at a convention in Visalia, all organized by Diaz. The deputies were all handpicked by Diaz. Stedman had a whole 5 minutes to plead her case against charges she'd never heard before, which undoubtedly included the boner theft of Hansted's liver-spotted boyfriend. The vote was taken by secret ballot and counted by, wait for it, Hansted and Diaz, and wouldn't you know it, at the tap of Diaz's gavel, Ocean View number 111 lost by 1 vote. It was a fraud, Stedman told me. The entire proceeding was a joke. What followed was the end of an era for Ocean View number 111, but the dawn of a new one for body snatchers, who, in 5 minutes flat, had defiled 125 years of Mendocino history. Or not. Those with eyeballs will notice something unique about that fraternal gathering place in Mendocino. It's topped with explicit statuary, something forbidden by all the Masonic high and mighties. When I asked 3-time Masonic Master Delbert Wade about that some time ago, he responded, yeah, we've been asked to take it down more than once, but as your own eyes can see, it's still there. Something that's entirely consistent with Mendocino's ethos today, a giant middle finger to the establishment. On the other hand, there's Pam Sandstrom, the gatekeeper of all things Eastern Star. Her phone number was front and center on Grand Chapter's version of what had come down, so I gave her a jingle. First, she had no superior to refer me to, requiring me to leave a message, and 2 days later she put me on indefinite hold. Well, 2 can play at that game. Her little operation has a website with an on-the-cheap security system for its contact list. Anybody with 2 IQ points to rub together could bypass it on Google by clicking on the cached version. That revealed an absolute trove of email addresses for the people Pam was supposed to keep me away from. So I dropped all 22 of them a little bombshell asking for their paperwork. IRS rules are ball-busters for nonprofit filings. All 501c3 charities are required to produce them on request, no questions asked, not just to the IRS, but to any member of the public. In 10 days flat, no exceptions. Scofflaws face a whopping $25 a day fine for ignoring it. When that happens, the requester can get the exact same thing from the IRS, which tends to put any violator on the IRS radar. You get the picture. My little ploy worked like a charm. In no time at all, I got an email response from Tammy Kinsey, who identified herself as the Grand Secretary there. As it turns out, everybody at Pam's little operation is a grand something or other, which makes sense after looking at IRS records. Pam's Sewing Circle runs a full-blown nonprofit conglomerate doing things that'd make a hooker blush, and all of it with charitable assets. When interviewing liars, it's important to get the truth somewhere else. So I pulled up the latest IRS filings for all of Pam's nonprofits, starting with her little public housing complex. It's bleeding like a stuck pig. By September 30, 2015, it was underwater to the tune of $6.6 million. And who do you think signed that filing? It was my new best friend, Grand Secretary Tammy Kinsey, under penalty of perjury. The housing nonprofit is sometimes controlled by Pam's nonprofit, the Grand Chapter of California Order of the Eastern Star. Sometimes not. Check. Next is a faux foundation called the California Eastern Star Foundation, supposedly there to support the public housing complex, but not really. That entity isn't controlled by Pam's nonprofit. By September 30, 2014, it had $7.6 million in the bank, nearly all of which was restricted for nice-sounding things like cancer research. Okay, unless you count the payments to affiliates expense of $171,712, some of that money, $46,903, went to the public housing complex, but another $126,311 went straight back to Pam's outfit. Then we have an endowment fund. That's titled Endowment Fund of the Grand Chapter, etc. The latest filing for that nonprofit was signed by Ms. Kinsey, too. By September 30, 2015, it had $26.2 million in the cookie jar. But there was a problem, a big one. When 3.3 million simoleons disappeared from its balance sheet, not that it matters because the endowment fund is an association, meaning that it has no legal standing in the Golden State, so if somebody raids its bank account, well, too bad. That appears to have been the case for fiscal year 2014, where the endowment fund paid another kickback to Pam's organization totaling $119,156. Finally, there's the top of the food chain, the Grand Chapter of California, Order of the Eastern Star, Pam's groovy place. It controls other nonprofits sometimes. By September 30, 2014, it had $21.7 million lying about. It's also an association completely unrecognized by the state of California, and none of its assets are restricted, so Pam's drum circle can do whatever they want with that money at any time. News to me was the nature of the parent filing. It wasn't a parent entity at all, but an association, with dead chapters listed all over the place, including Ocean View number 111. Was Pam doing that for money or pleasure? My go-to person for all things macabre is Ellie Cooney in Mendocino. She's an expert in that subject area. So I asked her why necrophiliacs did what they did. It's mostly for dominance, she told me. They feel inferior, so the act of having sex with a lifeless body fixes that. But what about trophies, like Pam's doing with Ocean View number 111? Ellie had something to say about that, too. Jeffrey Dahmer kept trophies of his victims in a freezer, she told me, mostly just body parts, which is pretty much what Pam was doing with Ocean View number 111. There's no substitute for a direct question, so I lowered the boom on Ms. Sandstrom and all her supine associates with a tastefully written email asking her to tell my readers the difference between what she and her peers are doing with Ocean View 111, their mother, and what Edmund Emil Kemper III did with his mother. And just like Stedman, they had 5 minutes each to plead their case. Then I copied that email to all of Pam's directors and officers and waited for a reply. Oscar Stedman was a wealth of information for this article. Not only that, she can explain the actual meaning of the statuary on top of the savings bank building, but I digress. Oscar's chapter has been around since 1891. Pam's got started in 2010, so I wanted to know how Pam started to skullfuck Ocean View number 111. Oscar Stedman. Is that Oscar, the cook, the chef, who I know? Could that possibly be Oscar? Wow, this is I'm going to ask her about it next time I see her at the theater company. Interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I sort of got off track a little bit. Educated people know how to spell the word California. That's a given. Pam's group doesn't. So she sent a letter to Ocean View number 111 to suspend its charter and demanded all of its assets with a big fat typo in the masthead. Pam must have been pounding a candy bar or two when she sent that letter out, because she also misspelled the email address of the only so-called author with balls, John Scott. He's a realtor in Fresno with a fine-looking home, something he probably doesn't want to lose in a nasty lawsuit. Nonetheless, I decided to check him out to see what kind of realtor he was. Governor Moonbeam has done a bang-up job of making public records available to the public. That includes the California Bureau of Real Estate's website. Mr. Scott's business is listed there, but just barely. Manta lists him as the president of Realty Property Management Incorporated. The CBRE lists Mr. Scott's license as restricted over some very sloppy business practices. A quick look at 3 administrative actions shows more. One involved the mismanagement of a $3 million trust account in 2007, where funds from one column somehow got moved to another and another. Mr. Scott got off with a slap on the wrist for that. The next incident happened in 2011, where one of Mr. Scott's brokers had the same darn problem. In that one, $13,000 disappeared. The broker got his license revoked, but Mr. Scott got away clean. Later that year, he wasn't so lucky. In April of 2010, auditors found a whopping $122,266 shortfall in Mr. Scott's trust account. The cause was a crooked bookkeeper who'd embezzled the money. Once again, Scott walked, but his bookkeeper went to jail. The actual theft took place in 2006. When Scott discovered it, he replaced the loss with his own money, but never told auditors where he'd gotten it, which was undoubtedly from another trust account, something that'd have to be replenished at some point in time. Scott didn't lose his broker's license because he didn't have one, so the business license got hammered. Scott's business has one review at the Better Business Bureau. That's all, and it's a nightmare. According to the complaint, a tenant had rented a flea-infested house from Scott's property management outfit in 2015. After complaining, the tenant was told they were immature and needed to grow up. Instead of covering the cost of carpet cleaning, Mr. Scott's business deducted it from the tenant's deposit. Stedman saw Scott as a ducks-in-a-row kind of guy. He was always in a tuxedo when I saw him, she recalled. Everything with John had to be done by the rules. When I asked if he'd ever spoken of being ripped off for six figures, Stedman said no. He's the last guy I figured that had happened to, she said. She had more to say about Chris Diaz. Diaz was a grand marshal on an official visit to Ukiah in 2013. Stedman was there representing Ocean View Chapter 111. Every chapter was supposed to have an organist. Stedman didn't have any, so she borrowed one from the Ukiah chapter. Everyone was dressed in formals and tuxedos, Stedman told me, and Chris Diaz came unglued at me for that. Diaz, according to Stedman, went charging across the room at her like a cranked-up tweaker. "What are you trying to pull?" Diaz shrieked. Stedman was shocked. It was the first time they ever laid eyes on each other. Cal State University at San Bernardino has a professor that matches Diaz's description along with her demeanor. Student reviews are pretty sour in the anthropology department for instructor Christine Diaz. Everything from the most boring professor I've had thus far to she misses a lot of her classes and is no help. Another was she threatened to fail the whole class when a video of hers seemed to have gone missing. But one single comment: horrible professor. She doesn't give out correct information. Sealed it for me. Plus, the address on Stedman's suspension letter is only a couple of miles from CSUSB, making it a handy commute. It was already a disaster when Diaz and Scott took over at Pam's operation in 2015. Diaz's temper and Scott's stupidity just made it worse. The kickbacks were especially problematic. It didn't take a rocket scientist to spot them. They're right on the Form 990s, marked open to public inspection for the whole world to see. So, of course, the bookkeeper would notice. That's when word got out. Panic doesn't come close to describing the letter that Diaz and Scott sent out to all the California Eastern Star chapters on October 5, 2016. Neither does the word bullshit. Pam's money tree was a skeleton by then, and people were asking questions like, where'd the money go? So the reigning king and queen of misfeasance, I was trying to make it say malfeasance, misfeasance, spewed lie upon lie about it, starting with Pam's subsidiaries and how a perfect storm of bad luck had created at $368,000 deficit for 2015/16. That would be a $368,000, quote, deficit. What Diaz and Scott didn't explain were the kickbacks from previous years, likewise for the fact that none of Pam's accounts were actually restricted. It's not likely that either of the grand worthy masters were rational or smart enough to have stolen anything during their tenure. By the same token, they were powerless to stop what had already been started, a mad dash for the last of the money. The best they could do was to stem the flow of information leaking from Pam's office, starting with the Form 990s. So it's 1 o'clock. You tune to KNYOLP Fort Bragg if you're in or near Fort Bragg, and KMECLP Ukiah if you're in or near Ukiah. And there goes the phone. Hi, you're on KNYOLP Fort Bragg. How can I help you?
Hey, happy